Good, good.
Good.
The whole gang's here.
What does that
All right.
mean?
We got everybody who showed up today.
Awesome.
So, yep. All right. Good evening, everyone. This is another installment of the University of Wyoming's Black Studies Center, our public history series, Let Freedom Ring series. And today we have a great guest, one who's not new to Wyoming at all, has been with us before on more than one occasions. But let me introduce Miss Kerandi as she will discuss the moments following the brutal assassination of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, as movements arose around the country and the world offering a critical eye to the role of policing in society. She will provide a student and citizen's perspective. In addition, she will examine the current state of the declaration of action that followed years later around the nation. Without further ado, we are so glad that you're here, Ms. Corinne. Good luck, even though you won't need it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Clint, so happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen and we should have just tested it. So everything should go well. Okay. So let me know when you can see everything and we'll get started. So today we're going to be talking about the Midwestern turning point, or what happened in Minneapolis during the summer of 2020. And I think a lot of us had that experience or saw the experience, but also in our own cities, right? So even if you weren't in Minneapolis, this was felt not only nationally, but truly around the world. And a lot of people saw this as a turning point, or as a moment in which we said, everything's going to change, everything's going to be something different from this moment on. Now, before we actually get to what happened in Minneapolis, we're going to kind of take a walk through some different things that I believe are important to understanding why that moment, George Floyd, was so critical. And that assassination really left us all in a different state than we were in before. So before we begin, a few ground rules. I'm far from perfect. I like to kind of set this up sometimes when speaking so that people understand that I have my own experiences and then the experiences I've learned through others, and then just knowledge that we've all acquired, whether it's been through school, oratory, somebody telling you something, but this is generally how we work. The other part is sometimes this space is somewhere where people kind of want to have a conversation, and it's important to do that, but it's not meant to be a comfortable space. It's supposed to be a reckoning. It's supposed to be awaken and understanding, and hopefully eventually enact change. And I absolutely love curiosity. I wish I was in a room right now so we could interact back and forth, but it's important to be curious. It's important to ask questions, but understand that curiosity can't just stop at curiosity. And as you learn things today, maybe you've known them or you haven't known them, make sure that also leads to action, because we all have a part to play wherever we are. The other part to this is there are triggers during this conversation of racial violence, sexual violence, and the disregard and disrespect for Black people throughout the conversation. I do want you to take care of yourself and do what's best for you and your wellness. And then finally, this topic is heavy, but I think what is even heavier is the experience that Black people have and face in our society today. So while we listen to these experiences, let us leave our own experiences out of it and really recognize what we're discussing today. And we don't need to necessarily parallel our oppressions, but rather be able to isolate those moments and give them the attention they deserve. And so empathy is my ask of us all. And the greatest demonstration of empathy to me is to act or actually listen to what you are, or hear what you're actually listening to. So I hope we can all stick to those, and let me know as we kind of go along. Okay. So this is a topic, or excuse me, a question that you can kind of answer for yourself or think about yourself, is why are discussions on race, privilege, class important if you believe they are? And I think it's important to start with this, because I think unless you see the importance in the matter, often we disregard or don't necessarily give it the listening ear it deserves. So for yourself, not what you've been taught, not just because it's a class, understand why these discussions are actually important and what we actually do with them past these moments and what it means as we operate in society. Always, 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 Black history is American history, despite its absence sometimes in the curriculum. Understanding that Black history is part of and is very prevalent in and operates within American history is extremely important. We understand that, Black people are often treated as three-fifths of a person, but as we move forward today and in current times, I need everyone to understand that we cannot separate the two, and they do not operate in silo. So we don't get to eradicate, remove, or extrapolate any part of our history. The two have to coexist together. Okay, so before we get to Minneapolis, which is where I was in 2020, we're going to kind of go back a little bit. First, I want us to understand when we talk about policing, one of the topics I'll be exploring today, I truly mean it in all of its forms. So the activity of controlling an industry, an activity, etc., to make sure that people obey the rules. And when I think of rules, I think of implicit and explicit rules, societal norms, whatever you want to dictate or name as the rule, is what you can consider or kind of put in that place. And then when we're talking about controlling an industry or an activity, think of that in whatever context you'd like. But this is what I think of as policing, not just law enforcement, but in all of its forms. So let's talk about Rodney King. Before you get to Rodney King, you have to address what happened in the Watts Rebellion. So these were riots that happened in LA in 1965. It was the Watts neighborhood was a predominantly Black neighborhood in LA. And these lasted for about 6 days, involving over 34,000 people. So you can kind of take the context of your campus and start to kind of think of how many people were in this area involved in these riots. It started after the Fry stepbrothers were pulled over for reckless driving. I would encourage you all to kind of go look at the story and the events that actually led up to the riots. But one of the things that outraged many of the people there is they believed the police had violence against a woman who was pregnant. Again, go read through the case and kind of what happened. But the riot themselves resulted in over 30 deaths, thousands of injuries, and over 4,000 arrests, and caused over 40 million in damages. So that money today would be about $380 million. So this happens in 1965, and people often look at the LA riots in two parts. So this would be part one, and the second part would be what happened with Rodney King. And Rodney King was born in Sacramento, California. He lived with his two parents, Ronald and Odessa King, and four siblings in a suburb of Pasadena. He worked as a construction worker, and he later passed away in 2012. So his story is extremely important in what it meant for police brutality, but also how we recognized and saw it in society. So if you ever have a chance to either read his book or understand why it was so important, a lot of it has to do with the fact that it was actually recorded. So March 3rd, 1991, he was being pursued by the police. It was a high-speed chase for driving well above the speed limit. Once stopped, they pulled him out of the car and brutally beat him. It was believed, or what was recorded, was he was beat anywhere from 53 to 56 times with the baton, shot twice with the taser gun, and then finally handcuffed. It was caught on camera at the time by a bystander that was pretty far away, but was still able to see the scene that was going on. 4 officers were charged, but that's in it. 3 ended up being acquitted, and they could not reach a verdict for the 4th officer. But what's interesting is there were actually other officers on the scene that necessarily weren't involved in the beating, but did not stop it. That's really important to remember because it was bystanderism, right? Nobody actually stopped the beating. You can assess that beating somebody over 53 times could be considered excessive force after actually already completing the high-speed chase and what it meant. So actually moving into the LA riots, that happened again in March, and then following the acquittal in April of 1992, the news spread of the verdict. And obviously people were outraged. How could this continue to happen? Why were we seeing that they were obviously acquitted for this? And was that necessary? I think to me, the clear answer is no, there's no reason you would need to do that in an arrest made at any time. But these were the things that people were asking themselves, especially after all 4 officers were not charged. The verdict also sparked riots similar to the Watts Rebellion, killing over 50 people, 2,000 injured, and 9,500 arrests, and possibly more. I mean, this is what we have documented. The damages of those riots were $1 billion, and today that would be about $2.1 billion. And at the time, the United States Department of Justice filed federal civil rights charges against the 4 officers. And in 1992, in August. Two of them were found guilty, while the other two were still yet acquitted. King was eventually awarded $3.8 million in a civil trial for the injuries he sustained. So now we're talking over a year after, and the case was retried, but still yet two officers were found to be not guilty. In 2012, he made this statement, the year of his passing, and he said, "It's not painful to relive it. I'm comfortable with my position in American history. It's like being raped, stripped of everything, beaten near to death there on the concrete, on the asphalt. I just knew how it felt to be a slave. I felt like I was in another world. I had to learn to forgive," he said. "I couldn't sleep at night. I got ulcers. I had to let go, to let God deal with it. No one wants to be mad in their own house. I didn't want to be angry my whole life. It takes so much energy out of you to be mean." And this is years and years later. And he, throughout his entire life, dealt with obviously this very brutal beating mentally, psychologically, and it permeated society. Because, like I said, again, this was kind of one of the earliest instances we talk about where the incident was actually recorded. Now let's move on to Trayvon Martin. Like I said, 2012 was when Rodney King passed away. And in that same year, we have the case with Trayvon Martin. He was born in Miami Gardens, Florida in 1995. He lived there with his mother. His father also lived in Florida, but a little distance away, where he attended high school, took honors classes. I mean, wanted to be a pilot, had an athletic frame, really active life. And he was 17 when he was killed in 2012. So February 26, 2012, he was walking home from the corner store. As we all know, he had Skittles, his hood was up, and he was fatally shot and killed by George Zimmerman, a part of the neighborhood watch. And if you spend some time watching the facts of this case, they're very interesting. Before even getting out of his vehicle or having the opportunity to even make contact with Trayvon, he was instructed after calling authorities not to leave his vehicle or to approach the individual. When we're talking about things that lead up to instances or moments before actions can take place, these things are preventable. There are ways in which are safeguards that are put in place that should be followed, or quote unquote rules that should be obeyed, that would have put this situation in a very different position than it ended up being. He was asked not to leave his vehicle and defied that. But as we later see, to some extent, somebody might see this as being rewarded rather than the defilement of the law that we saw with others like Rodney King or the Watts Rebellion, met with brutal force. So as you see, he defied both. He later says he shot Trayvon in self-defense after he was brutally beaten. If you go and look at the facts of the case and why it took so long, was the back and forth with Mr. Zimmerman and others. Nothing was ever straight. We never actually got a straight story of what happened, and things were constantly going back and forth. But at the end of the day, when I look at this, you can talk all about the impact, but the cause itself, where Mr. Zimmerman decided to defy what was being asked of him, would have, again, put everything in a different position. Whether or not the neighborhood was having burglaries or constant things, if he was asked to do certain thing and didn't do it, but was rewarded. The police initially decided not to arrest Mr. Zimmerman, sparking protests around the nation. In April 2012, he was finally charged with second-degree murder. In July, the following year, he was acquitted. Now, when we talk about policing, I really do think of it in all of its forms. When you think of how love has been policed in the Black families all the way from the time of slavery, police in themselves started as slave catchers, right? Policing movement. When you talk about the syphilis studies that were done and, the fact that we've been policing bodies, all these things and policing the way it happens and the ways in which they've wanted things to look a certain way for such a long time has been evident. When we talk about the abolishment or the defundment of policing, it's not just law enforcement, I believe we're looking at policing and how it permeates in society in all of its forms, in suspensions in school, detentions for young Black boys, and the ways in which Black children are projected to be in their classrooms. It happens everywhere, right? There's a regulatory body that exists that is white supremacy that tries to eradicate and police and put together Black people. So now we can move to 2020 and what this actually meant. in our society. So the assassination of George Floyd. This was a huge moment in my life. I think I can really recall the Trayvon Martin case. And I actually remember hearing the verdict over the radio and being extremely frustrated at what had happened. But more so than that, I think it was frustrating for me because I almost felt like I couldn't do anything. I remember being 12 or 13 at the time, maybe even younger. And my parents were like, I don't know about you protesting. They were nervous. There was just moments in which they were concerned about safety, and understandably so. But these were, once we got to 2020, in being in Minneapolis, to me, there was nothing else to do but take action. But first, let's actually look at these events. And hopefully we've all had a chance to understand these, but let's take a look back. So May 25th, 2020, a trip to Cub Foods. So this is a store, or a corner store, convenience store that exists kind of in the center of a part of Minneapolis. And a report was made that evening. Somebody called the authorities, and after Mr. Floyd had bought a pack of cigarettes. Now, they believed that whatever money he had used at that time was counterfeit. Now, I always like to highlight the fact that they say believed because nothing was proven. There's no record or anyone that has ever told the story that has said, hey, he took out his marker and he checked the bill and it was counterfeit. There's no one that's ever said that they ran it in any way or did any checks to make sure. It was all on assumptive basis. Whatever biases or understanding that store employee took into account to believe that that money was counterfeit. Mr. Floyd had been living in Minneapolis for several years after moving from Texas and had been working in different places in the city, but had been left jobless after the pandemic. He had been to Cuff Foods before. It wasn't the first time. Many people knew him to be a friendly face, a pleasant customer who often didn't cause trouble. And the store owner, Mike himself, told them this, right? This was not like he was walking to a store he had never been in or that the community didn't know him, but still, even yet, these actions took place. The day of the actual incident, or on May 25th, the owner was not there to see Mr. Floyd, or that the fact that, the report was happening by one of the teenage workers. People often say it was just following protocol. But again, we have heard no stories of being able to check. And the fact that this person was a young person, to me, just tells us we have a lot more work to do on education, whether it's biases, whether it's understanding discrimination, whether it's understanding how you treat people, or the preconceived notions that you might have that might cause you to misjudge someone. And the 911 call that was actually made, the employee told the operator that he had demanded the cigarettes back, but Mr. Floyd didn't want to do that. He had rightfully paid for what he had asked for. And according to the transcript that was released, the employee said the man appeared drunk and not in control of himself. But nothing here to me has yet warranted. Nothing here talks about a public disruption or possibly harming anyone, warranted a police call just yet. Next, shortly after the call, some officers arrived. So we've moved from a call to now we have two officers on the scene, not just one, but two. And Mr. Floyd was sitting with two other people in a car parked around the corner. So still around the vicinity, the neighborhood, or his community, where he rightfully has the place to be. After approaching the car, one of the officers, Thomas Lane, pulled out his gun and ordered for Mr. Floyd to show his hands. Again, at no point have we heard that he asked him why he was there, asked him what happened, asked to see the bill himself, test it himself, or really assess the situation, but instead goes straight to Mr. Floyd with his gun drawn. In an account of the incident, prosecutors do not explain why he thought it was necessary to draw his gun. I'll leave you all to be able to draw your own conclusions there, but it did not necessitate him to release his gun at any point during this situation. Mr. Lane, the prosecutor said, put his hands on Mr. Floyd and pulled him out of the car. Then Mr. Floyd actively resisted being handcuffed. Understandably so. Once handcuffed, though, Mr. Floyd became compliant, while Mr. Lane explained he was being arrested for passing counterfeit currency. Court transcripts from police body cameras show Mr. Floyd appears cooperative at the beginning of the arrest, repeatedly apologizing to officers after they had parked his car. Mr. Lane asked Mr. Floyd to show his hands at least 10 times before ordering him to get out of the vehicle. It was then when officers tried to put Mr. Floyd in their squad car, that a struggle ensued. This is I mean, if you can start to imagine some of these events taking place, it's a very scary engagement. Even had this been the crime that has yet to be confirmed, there's ways in which society has said that we would expect law enforcement to proceed in situations like this. We would expect them to assess the situation, expect them to prove that it was a counterfeit bill, expect them to have a conversation before drawing their gun, expect them to approach the vehicle with respect, because once again, their job in regards to protecting society or protecting the community is extremely important, but even more so is required. That is their role, is to protect them. And this is the very community in which Mr. Floyd was living. A new arrival. After Mr. Floyd stiffened up, fell to the ground, and told officers he was claustrophobic. According to the report, Mr. Chauvin arrived at the scene. He and other officers were involved in a further attempt to put Mr. Floyd in the police car. During this attempt, during this attempt, Mr. Chauvin pulled Mr. Floyd away from the passenger seat, causing him to fall to the ground. He lay there face down, still in handcuffs. When talking about claustrophobia or his experiences that he was having, all of his wellness throughout this was being disregarded. And you can start to see how they were characterizing Mr. Floyd. You can start to see how he was being disregarded. He's on the ground. He's in handcuffs. A gun was drawn. His wellness throughout this entire experience was not being recognized. Similar to Mr. Rodney King being beaten in front of everyone and talks about really feeling like a disregarded person on the asphalt. You can start to see quite literal parallels to what has happened years and decades later and in between these two incidences. That's when witnesses started to film Mr. Floyd, who appeared to be in a distressed state. These moments, captured on multiple mobile phones and shared widely on social media, would prove to be Mr. Floyd's last. Final moments. Mr. Floyd was restrained by officers while Mr. Chauvin placed his left knee between his head and his neck for more than 9 minutes. He kept his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck, the prosecutors say. The duration was initially given as 8 minutes and 46 seconds, but prosecutors have since revised that time upwards, in fact. The transcript of the body cam footage from officers Lane and J. Alexander show Mr. Floyd said more than 20 times that he could not breathe as he was restrained. He was also pleading for his mother and begging, please, please, please. Now, when we're talking about not breathing, let's really assess the fact that not only has his wellness disregarded, but now we have reached the fact that his life no longer means anything to these officers. It's no longer important to them for this Black life to be kept, sustained, or even to the extent of even having the conversation about what was going on. And still, even yet, through this entire process, we have not even proved that he had utilized a counterfeit bill. Whatever he's being accused of, whatever they are killing him for, and whatever they're choosing to assassinate him for, they still have yet to prove. At one point, Mr. Floyd Gaston says, "You're going to kill me, man." Could literally feel his life leaving his body. And instead of taking notice, no officer stepped in. No person was able to step in and stop, despite what others were saying. Again, seeing the very same thing we saw with Rodney King, of bystanderism and allowing for these things to happen and being complicit. Officer replies, "Then stop talking, stop yelling. It takes a heck of a lot of oxygen to talk." He says, "I can't believe this, man. Mom, love you, love you. Tell my kids I love them. I'm dead." A female bystander told the police, "His nose is bleeding. Come on now." About 6 minutes into that period, Mr. Floyd became non-responsive. In videos of the incident, this was when Mr. Floyd fell silent as bystanders urged the officers to check his pulse. Officer King did just that, checking Mr. Floyd's right wrist, but couldn't find one. Yet the other officers did not move. Now at this point, according to this officer, he no longer has life. They're no longer able to detect a heartbeat. And still, and even yet, in that moment, no one chooses to step in. No one says, let's pause. No one says we need a break, because this is exactly how it was supposed to work. I mean, this is exactly what they wish to do. At no point has anyone stopped and regarded this Black life. Motionless, Mr. Floyd was rolled onto a gurney and taken to the Hennepin County Medical Center in an ambulance and pronounced dead about an hour later. So what does this tell us? And what do these things mean? Like we've walked through and kind of started to see the parallels between Rodney King and George Floyd, not only were both recorded, all of them were seen by others in the room, but there's also other officers present who decided not to engage. And what that tells us is we have a systematic failure for us, but it's not a flawed system, it's an efficient one. This is exactly how slave catchers were designed, to catch these bad people and be able to find them in whatever act they chose to, because they didn't regard them with human life or humanity. In these moments when they were being caught and really to be brought back to their owners, to be enslaved, this was their motivation. This is what they wanted to do. That is a true inception of policing. So when people often talk about bad apples, you have to talk about the root of something before you can talk about the fruit that it bears. And it's in very root, it is a bad core. Policing was never meant to protect Black citizens or Black people. It was always intended to, in fact, remove them and find them in the wrong. But where's education on all of this? Where do we see our systems of higher education or our secondary school systems? And there is no exception. Education is a form of society. And in fact, we do see policing in a form, like I mentioned, in terms of suspensions, in terms of detentions, in terms of how children are treated, and also the very actual presence of law enforcement or public safety officers, as some describe them, in our schools. When we take a look back, education has also been a place where we've seen people protest and people raise their arms and not be comfortable. Some of my favorite examples: in 1923, students at Florida A&M University and HBCU staged a 3-month protest and boycotted classes and firebombed a building, demanding the resignation of the institution's president, who accommodated segregation policies. These were students, it's an HBCU, that were not okay with what was going on. And when you think of 3 months of the education that you paid for and boycotting to make sure that they were not in line, students are the largest stakeholder of any university and deserve and require and demand a return on their investment. This is authoring Lucy Foster. In 1952, the University of Alabama admitted authoring Lucy Foster and Polly Ann Myers, 2 Black graduate students, before learning of their race. And after, Thurgood Marshall and others joined the fight to desegregate the University of Alabama after admissions officials refused to let them enroll in class. In 1956, they enrolled at U of A and were attacked by a white mob on her 3rd day on campus. Officials promptly expelled her for what they say was her own protection. So in this situation, again, what we're seeing is a disregard. Her education, her merit, her work ethic, anything she had done based on the color of her skin. Instead of actually treating the problem, we were treating what we consider the impact. The very root of the problem was the treatment of her classmates, rather than the fact that her admission was denied, or the fact that her very presence was a true threat to those students on that campus. And what we continue to see in society is the exact same thing. And that's where the policing comes in. It's a controlling factor. How do you keep things in the tight-knit box you want them to be? Because the moment you start to see a threat to the system you've created, you remove it. You close the threat. In 1963, this is one of my favorite examples when we talk about children being a part of the movement. 4,000 American children organized themselves on what they call D-Day, a mass demonstration of students leaving schools and actually being able to participate in their own protests. We're talking about school-age children, really young children. And even for the police that tried to stop them, they prevailed. Even the ones that were arrested, they continued. In 1968, police officers opened fire on a peaceful civil rights protest at South Carolina State University and HBCU, and what was known as the Orangeburg Massacre. These students were killed for protesting at their own school, and over 30 demonstrators were wounded. Now, what this tells us, or why I really like going through these examples, is students have a voice and will always have a voice, and they must be heard. To ignore students or ignore the greatest stakeholder of any institution of learning is really to ignore the point or the purpose of education. There is no education, there is no college, university without its students. And they're literally the highest paying stakeholder, especially at public institutions, including land grant ones, where we have the charter from the state, and then we have the funds that students provide to run our universities. So, what happened after the assassination of George Floyd? When I was in Minneapolis at the time, I was a student at the University of Minnesota, attending classes there. I was also had the opportunity to serve as the first Black undergraduate student body president. And at the time, this was during my term in the summer. After seeing these events and being disgusted by what was going on and the fact that we were seeing this in our very own backyard, we no longer, as a society, if some people know Minnesota nice or people believe the ways in which we operate are more practical, or you might even consider a perspective that highlights or understands these issues, was not present when these events were going on. And to me, it was unacceptable. As an institution, we had our place in society. As a land grant institution, we had our place in society, and we did not get to ignore these factors. You don't get to put as statements of admission of diversity, equity, inclusion on your website, or get to talk about all these different things, but then not follow up with action. When students are talking about being safe and talking about the ways in which they feel on campus, it's not the objective matter of the fence that protects them or the presence of X amount of officers or X amount of helplines. Safety is subjective. Safety is trust. Safety is saying that I'm going to ensure that I'm at risk, but I have an institution that will protect me. But institutions on themselves are flawed. And so when students are asking for safety measures, this is what they mean. So after seeing this, I decided to draft a letter to our administration asking them to release all ties they had with the Minneapolis Police Department. If you read the MPD 150 report, it was a report that was created to really examine the Minneapolis Police Department for the last 150 years. And what you'll see is they are no stranger to incidents like these. And so when I wrote this letter, it was to say we have students on our campus that are citizens of Minneapolis, that are operating within Minneapolis, who live, eat, breathe, pay taxes in Minneapolis, and we have to make sure we also protect them. This is the final paragraph. We have lost interest in discussions, community events, community conversations, and donut hours. We no longer wish to have a meeting or come to an agreement. There is no middle ground. The police are murdering Black men with no meaningful repercussions. This is not a problem of some other place or some other time. This is happening right here in Minneapolis. We no longer tolerate the ineffective, inconsistent bias training that rarely serves as more than a fig leaf. We have no purview or jurisdiction over the operations of the Minneapolis Police Department except as citizens of Minneapolis. However, as student leaders, we do have a stake in the operations of the University of Minnesota Police Department. Therefore, we clearly and without hesitation demand that the University of Minnesota Police Department ceases any partnerships with the Minneapolis Police Department immediately. This is inclusive of any previous contracts, events, security operations, and any additional relations that were inclusive of the Minneapolis Police Department, barring any reporting structures. As a land grant institution, statements professing appreciation, diversity, and inclusion are empty and worthless if they are not backed up by action. A man was murdered. It is our job as an institution to exert whatever pressure we can to keep our students safe and demand justice in our city and state. We expect a reply to this concern within 24 hours of receipt. With deep loss, disgust, and exhaustion, Kerandi, a Black woman, the undergraduate student body president. At the time, I watched the video the morning of May 26th one time, and that was all I needed to see. I never watched the video again, and I have no desire to ever see it again. But after seeing that, I immediately knew we no longer needed to have the police on our campus. I had to consult with my own executive board. We went to a protest that evening. I came home and we had an executive board meeting and we discussed it. And of course, there was, to some extent, some pushback, but eventually we unanimously passed the approval of this letter and was able to release it to the public. And then I sent it to our administration and gave them 24 hours. And the importance of giving them 24 hours, to me, there was no black, like this was black and white. There was no gray to be found. And if our university necessitated to have statements of diversity, if we were going to report statistics on race and the ways we've integrated, and if we were going to talk about the ways we support our students, we needed to back it up with action. There was a clear action path to take, and there was the option to do it and do it quickly and swiftly. And yes, higher education moves slow, but when it comes down to matters of life and death, we had an action take and we had to take it quickly. What happened after this is what I wasn't expecting, is the overflow of national support and individuals actually recognizing this letter that was being penned to our university. And while a lot of the times as students we were writing it, I remember saying to a good friend of mine, I was perfectly okay with my name being on, because if they didn't reply, if there was no discussion on what had actually happened, I was okay with being the name on the letter. I was okay with everyone coming down on me. And, some of the things that people wrote back to me or said was okay, because at the end of the day, a man was murdered. There was a little girl that was left without her father. There was a community that was left without their community member. There was loved ones that were left without their loved one. And we were all going to sleep that night, and our loved ones were there. To some extent, you stop thinking about yourself and understand that the society that you want to create for somebody today is also the society you're going to want your children to live in. And the society that I'm in today, somebody wanted me to live in. And we stand on the backs of our ancestors and those that have worked so hard that it did not matter in those moments. It wasn't to fear, because I wasn't ever alone. In fact, I had thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, people standing right next to me. And we ended up having people sign the letter and got individuals from all over the nation that supported this letter. But what went on beyond that, I could have never imagined, was when student governments and student leaders across the country started to ask their institutions to do the very same thing, understanding that the presence of police and the ways policing was occurring on their campuses was discriminatory, that was not actually serving their students. When we actually talked about the cases at the University of Minnesota that police had actually responded to, it was interesting because there wasn't many, but we were always talking about their presence and talking about what we needed. But police were not coming to us and understanding what students needed. Law enforcement was not talking with us. Our police department was truly meant to serve students, but they weren't doing that. Now, what's happening today? Now, before I get into that, the letter was responded to, and at the time they started to make 2 actions in large events and also with their K-9 unit and severing those ties. Today, what looks like around society is that those moments and the ways in which people were operating in 2020 are exactly what some people feared. That there would be this climactic moment that people would understand what was going on, but weren't willing to create long-lasting change. And if anything, the dollars or the efforts that were put forth were just that in that moment, and what people would often term as performative. That the actions that people were taking were not actually considered to be those that actually served our community. And we see that in the actual ways in which this works, it is systemic. So when we talk about what needs to change, it cannot just be a dollar amount. Companies all over the nation, in fact, all over the world, were making pledges and ways in which they wanted to listen and programs in which they wanted to start. And while some of these exist, and we might even see fruit from some of these long-lasting changes, the interim or the short-term changes or the ways in which we wanted these programs funding to continue have often ceased. And you'll notice that people no longer have the same outrage. They no longer have the same passion and no longer see these things as obscene. In fact, it has become so normal for Black life to be lost that we no longer recognize it as a loss. It becomes a casualty of simply existing. People expect these things to happen, not understanding that young Black boys are taught police etiquette at such a young age, or recognizing the fact that in so many ways, Black people exist in society in a scale of fear, understanding that the only people that have our back is us. So when we look at society today, I would love to be able to tell you all that I think that was a turning point that changed everything. But in fact, what we start to see is people going right back to what happened. And when you look at the case that just recently happened with Terry Nichols, that's why I talk about policing as a system. It is not the police officer as an individual. It is not meant to be offensive towards one individual person. It is a very institution of policing, their unions, the ways in which they work, things that have been acquitted that should have never been acquitted, ways in which they've been protected when it should have not been protected. Life is not meant to be at the hands of another life. And often they get to hold the purse strings of Black lives consistently around our society. And what Black people have long been saying and keep saying is no more. We no longer want to sit here and allow these things to happen and sit and be quiet. But us being in the protesting and being in the streets has clearly not been what people are listening to, but we will continue, we will push forward and exert whatever means necessary to make these changes, permeating the system in different ways, and also making sure that people understand that as citizens of society, as citizens in America, deserve the same rights, privileges afforded by the Constitution to all its people. So when we think about how we move forward and in what ways we can make these changes, it's how we all operate in society. It's the ways in which we talk to different people. It's the ways in which we understand our biases and understand the ways in which we treat other people. See, this is not just a Black or white issue. This is a human issue. It's a humanitarian issue. And once you start to see that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was meant to be afforded to the mankind of America, you start to understand that if you actually look at it as a human issue, you start to understand why it is so important for us all to treat Black people like they should. When we say Black Lives Matter, that does not necessarily negate anybody else's, but it puts the emphasis and the intention of what has often been disregarded and removed from any respect in our country today. So as you look at kind of what has happened in all of the ways in which policing has existed, and obviously I could not cover every single case that has existed in the last decade or 2-3 decades, but if you look at the parallels of what happened with Rodney King, and you look at the parallels of what happened with George Floyd and his assassination, you start to understand that our society is not changing, and it's not changing fast enough, and these systems exist so clearly today as they did in 1992 and as they did in 1965. And if we have anything to do with it, it is our job, our duty as citizens of this world to make sure that these things don't continue. So thank you very much. And at this time, I'd be happy to open up for questions.
All right. So, Ms. Kerandi,
Yes.
very impactful. Um, the thrust of this research is born out of what Dr. Carter G. Woodson says. He says the essence of scholarship is truth.
Mm.
And you have nailed the truth in a very intellectual, intentional, and scholarly manner. So, from us here at the University of Wyoming in the Introduction to African American History class, we want to say thank you and give you a round of applause.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. So, can anyone give a statement, one of your ice sheet statements, very quickly, so that we can have a conversation, a brief conversation with Ms. Kerandi? Did anybody have anything written down? Somebody go right ahead, please. Michelle.
So just thinking about something that you said that I'm not sure that I entirely agree with, and just want to ask you a little bit more about that it's not a flawed system, it's an efficient one. I mean, can it be flawed and efficient? Can it be flawed because its intention is to be efficient? I just struggled with that statement.
Yeah. So is your question, can it be both?
Yeah. I mean, and maybe that's what you were already saying, but I just noticed myself really
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think something of what I said, it's not flawed to them, right? It's flawed to me, because the system in which it's designed hurts Black bodies, hurts Black people. But I say it's efficient because that's how it was designed. that's what it was intended to do by its designers, right? Like it was not created to support Black people. When we talk about policing, when you look at policies to do with redlining and how people were housed and how they were pushed out, those policies on redlining in actual deeds were put to make sure Black people were removed. While I believe that is a very flawed thought process, that is very efficient because it worked on their part. Does that kind of make sense? So to some extent, yes, but it depends who the stakeholder is.
I think that's an excellent way to answer the question. That was an excellent question. And I think what Ms. Kerandi explains is that we have two different realities. We have two different sets of lived experiences. But I want to go back to her being empirically correct. She talks about this idea of policing beginning as slave patrols. And if it begins as slave patrols and it has matured and nurtured through systemic understanding of those who are human and those who need to be policed as inhuman, then it becomes a very efficient system that is flawed from the very beginning, but for the purpose of retaining and advancing and furthering the status quo of American society. All right, I think we got another one.
I have something to build off that. One concept that I didn't fully agree with was at the beginning you said, you defined policing as controlling. Could you relate or just explain on that? Like, how is it? Why do you think it's controlling, or why do you define it as controlling?
Yeah, I appreciate that. One, I think you're talking about my initial definition at the start of the presentation, correct?
Yes.
Okay, yes. So that's a direct quote from the Oxford Dictionary. That's not my personal one, but I think when we talk about control, anything that kind of starts to look at things in a certain way or start to frame a narrative in a certain way, to me, I look as control. While that was the actual definition, I think we actually see how it is played out. Police have control over how many arrests they make. They have control over how they act in situations. In school, they have control over how many suspensions they can make. In hospitals, doctors who disregard Black women when they're having their children have control over how many times they have these discussions when women are asking for help. And we see actually the maternal death rates rise by race. So when I talk about control, I think of it less as, I think maybe in this authoritative way or manner, but rather in the levers that are afforded to pull to create a certain outcome. They get to determine these things. If somebody had walked into the situation, or Mr. Zimmerman walked into the situation, Trayvon, and he was told to stay in the car and not approach him, it's possible Trayvon Martin could have been alive today. If they had pursued that high-speed chase and simply arrested Rodney King instead of brutally beating him, we might have had a different outcome today. If they walked into that store at Cup Foods and said, "Can we check this counterfeit bill?" George Floyd might be with us today. If they had walked into Breonna Taylor's house and actually asked questions and not participated in that way, she might still be here today. So when I talk about control, there's levers that these systems afford their most superior members to choose to be able to shape things, to obey the rules. And when I said implicit or explicit, it's rules that have been created intra-community, whether it's within Black communities on police etiquette. And when you talk to Black sons who often talk about put your hands on the steering wheel, make sure everything can be seen. That's implicit. When we talk about explicit rules about how in which we operate or what's being asked of us when you're going in order to get your children to a certain school because we've been pushed to a certain area because of gentrification. That's kind of what I interpret that to be, but that's a direct definition itself. That's not my own.
All right, so Ms. Kerandi,
Yes.
This movement that started from those folks who you were attuned to that responded to the assassination of George Floyd, the defund the police, there's automatically a response to that. And I think a lot of what you're saying are the responses to perceived or practical advancement by Blacks when we consider nationalism and the rise of nationalism and a response to that. So now, as we sit here in 2023, what's the state of the defund police movement And if you could give us your thoughts about how that all transpired and what you thought of.
Yeah, I think when I look at it now, I think you'll see, I don't want to use the word slow down, but you'll see that those conversations are not as present as they were prior to. I'm not currently in Minneapolis, so my engagement within that community has now been limited. But I would say that, excuse me, when I think of how those events transpired and why they exist, I think people hear defund and they hear abolish and they get scared, right? They think of it as a very radical idea. But I think in any other part of our society, if we saw people being killed and removed from society by literally life or death, we would make a change. There's no system that exists otherwise that we would be like, oh, I think that's okay and we don't need to make a difference. If a doctor was administering a drug and the study showed that a high percentage of its members that were taking that certain drug were being killed, we would no longer use the drug. So instead of looking at policing as this part of society that must exist in this exact way, instead it's to remove a system, understand where it came from, and then you rebuild what safety looks like in response to the citizens that it serves. So when I look at it today, and I guess my hope today is a continuation of the reimagination of policing. Unfortunately, we've seen people actually walk back commitments. We've seen people no longer necessarily discuss commitments or still shy away from the topic. But to me, these things must still be top of mind because, again, we're still seeing things like Tyree Nichols happen.
So where do you see the future for Minneapolis police? Not just your druthers, but what do you see as the actual future of the Minneapolis police?
I see a system where we are removing policing in its form that it exists today, and you create a system where people feel safe and reliable according to city. I wish I could tell you an exact image of what that looks like, but I don't know. I really don't know because it's not just me in that. But I really do see a way in which you talk about the American policing system as something that has completely gone away due to its inception. Its very root is, to its very core, is extremely negative and completely contradicts what we call today our societal values.
Well, we want to thank you again, and you're always welcome back. And please continue the research, continue the movement, and stay connected. We will stay connected. But just remember, whatever we can do to help, that puts us right as partners in this particular struggle. We want to thank you again.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all. I truly enjoyed my time with you all. And those who have asked questions, those who still have questions, please feel free to ask me. I think to be critical to me is a show of interest and an understanding of why we believe what we believe and why these things exist. So continue to ask those questions and understand those things. And last thing I forgot to say, none of these views they're all my own, don't necessarily reflect my employer, but I'm really pleased to be here and discuss these things with you because they're very near and dear to my heart.
Is it okay if we forward a few through email?
Yes, I would be. Please do. Please do.
All right. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Happy Monday and happy Black History Month.
All right. Take care. Move mountains on Monday. Way to go. Thank you so much, Mr. Kerandi.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon. Bye.
All right.